Miss Marple, 2 deaths, 1 killer. Hello dear friends, it's lovely to have you join us once again at Warm Chapters. I'm Thomas, here to keep you company as the day draws to a close. Now get comfortable and listen along. Chapter 1. A Death Beneath the Autumn Sky. The first days of October came to St Mary Mead with that peculiar courtesy which autumn sometimes shows to an old English village. There was no abruptness in the change, no violent stripping of the trees, no harsh wind rattling at window panes. Instead, the season seemed to enter quietly, with gloved hands and lowered voice, as though it knew that in such a village even weather ought to behave with propriety. The mornings were cool, clear, and faintly luminous. The light, falling now at a lower angle, touched the cottage gardens with a soft gold, making even the simplest things appear momentarily significant. A rake left against a wall, a row of late Michaelmas daisies, the red flank of an apple caught between leaves. Along the lane the lime trees let fall their yellowing leaves one by one, without haste, as though each had considered the matter carefully before descending. There was wood smoke in the air, damp earth beneath it, and the faint, sweet decay of flowers that had remained in bloom longer than anyone had any right to expect. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the sitting-room window and observed it all with the composed pleasure of one who had long ago learned that nothing in this world was too small to be worth noticing. Her knitting lay in her lap. The pale wool had advanced several inches since breakfast, but for the last few minutes the needles had been still. Miss Marple's eyes were fixed upon a robin on the bird table. The little creature hopped twice, tilted its head with immense self-importance, and stabbed at a crumb as though performing some serious duty. Miss Marple watched it with interest. Not sentimentality exactly, though there was kindness in her expression, but rather the attentive curiosity she gave to all living things, especially those whose habits revealed more than they intended. Yet even the robin did not possess the whole of her attention. A part of her mind, a cool and orderly part, had remained with what she had heard that morning. Mrs. Dolly Bantry had called at 10 o'clock, as she sometimes did when there was news in the village too substantial to be left to chance repetition. Dolly Bantry was a large, comfortable, good-hearted woman, with a direct manner and a remarkable instinct for arriving just when information had begun to circulate, but had not yet hardened into gossip. She had settled herself in the chair opposite Miss Marple, accepted tea, and assumed the grave yet animated expression of a person who has come prepared to relate everything in its proper order. "You will have heard about poor Mrs. Carrington," Dolly had begun. Miss Marple had lifted her eyes from the teapot. "I heard only that she'd been taken ill." "Not ill, my dear. Gone." Dolly lowered her voice, though there was no one else in the room. It was Tuesday morning. The girl who comes in to do for her found her. Foster, I believe her name is. A sensible sort of girl by all accounts. She arrived as usual and found Mrs. Carrington sitting in her chair by the window, quite peaceful, as though she had merely fallen asleep. Miss Marple made a small sound. It expressed neither surprise nor disbelief, but acknowledged the seriousness of what had been said. Dr. Haydock came at once, Dolly continued, stirring her tea though she had not yet added sugar. He was quite clear about it. Signed the certificate without difficulty. Heart failure. Apparently she had a weak heart, though she never made a point of it. "No," said Miss Marple softly, "she would not." Edith Carrington had been one of those people whom one knows in a village without necessarily knowing intimately. Miss Marple had spoken with her after church at the horticultural show, once or twice in the village hall over arrangements for flowers. She was a widow of some 12 years, a gentle woman in her middle 60s, mild in speech, modest in dress, and particularly proud of her sweet peas. There had been nothing forceful about her. She neither demanded attention nor inspired irritation, and because of that, perhaps, she had been more generally liked than many more noticeable people. She was very well thought of, Miss Marple said. "Very," Dolly agreed warmly. "Everyone says so. Agnes Morrow is quite cut up about it, I hear. They were close, you know. Agnes called on her regularly. She was the one who went round to tell people after Dr. Haydock had been. Quite composed, they say, but dreadfully shaken underneath. Miss Marple set her cup down carefully. Mrs. Agnes Morrow, she repeated. The name was placed as Miss Marple placed all names, not merely in memory but in relation to other names, habits, streets, histories, and small observed peculiarities. She knew Mrs. Morrow by sight and by reputation, a woman in her early 50s perhaps, with a smooth, attentive manner and a genius for making herself useful. She remembered birthdays, dietary preferences, the exact shade of flowers that suited a room, the day on which someone's rheumatism was usually worse, and the sort of cake that ought to be brought when calling on a semi-invalid. Such qualities had given her a reputation for exceptional kindness. Miss Marple did not doubt the kindness. She merely knew that useful people often became informed people, and informed people were sometimes powerful in ways no one troubled to define. "And Leonard Price?" Miss Marple asked after a moment. "Was he much affected?" Dolly looked mildly surprised. "You know Leonard Price?" "I know of him. He lodges at the end of Vicarage Lane, I believe, a retired clerk of some kind. He attended St. Bartholomew regularly until his knees began troubling him. Quiet, careful, rather observant." "Yes, that is him exactly," Dolly nodded. "He was at the house when Agnes Morrow called. Apparently he and Edith Carrington were acquainted through some correspondence society. Stamps, I think, or perhaps old postcards. One of those quiet hobbies people take up when life has grown smaller, but not necessarily duller. He offered to help with arrangements. Quite practical, I'm told." "Did he?" Miss Marple said it very lightly. There was a pause. Outside, the robin vanished from the bird table with a flick of brown wings. The garden, deprived of that tiny movement, seemed suddenly very still. "And Miss Trent," Miss Marple added. Dolly looked up sharply. "Sylvia Trent? How did you know she was involved?" "I didn't know," said Miss Marple. "I wondered." Dolly accepted this, as old friends of Miss Marple often learn to accept such things. "She's connected in a practical way. She keeps accounts for several people in the village. A sort of informal bookkeeping service. Edith Carrington was one of her clients, I believe. Sylvia called yesterday to see whether there was anything needing attention. Very efficient young woman. Cool as ice, some people say." Miss Marple nodded. Sylvia Trent she knew rather better, or at least more precisely. She was in her early 30s, handsome in a severe way, with dark hair, clear eyes, and that particular reserve which is not shyness but a decision. She spoke plainly, measured her words, and rarely softened them for the comfort of others. Some found her refreshing, others found her discouraging. She was the daughter of the late Colonel Trent, who had once lived in the large house beyond the village. After his death, 4 years earlier, Sylvia had arranged all necessary matters with remarkable efficiency, sold what had to be sold, moved into a smaller cottage, and built for herself a quiet, competent life. She had been delicate for some time, Dolly said again, returning to Mrs. Carrington with the slight repetition of someone still trying to settle a fact into place. And yet it is always shocking, isn't it? Even when one expects such things eventually. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "it is." She had not said then what she was thinking. It was not yet a thought firm enough for words, only a faint movement of the mind, the merest stirring beneath the surface, a small thing. But Miss Marple had learned by long experience that small things should never be bullied into silence merely because they were small. People who were delicate, she reflected, often arranged their lives with great care, not always dramatically, not in a way that strangers noticed. But they developed habits, resting after lunch, taking medicine at a certain hour, avoiding stairs after dusk, refusing rich food in the evening, keeping to rooms where the fire drew well. A woman with a weak heart and a sensible nature would almost certainly know her limitations. She would become regular because regularity was a form of self-preservation. Miss Marple had not explained this to Dolly. She had only said mildly, "People who are delicate often take particular care of themselves." Dolly had looked at her with the affectionate uncertainty of a woman who sensed depth beneath smooth water, but could not yet see what lay there. Then the conversation had moved on. The harvest supper, the new curtains at the post office, a disagreement about the cricket pavilion, and ordinary village life as it always did had covered the matter over. But now, in the quiet afternoon, Miss Marple sat again with her knitting and considered. Outside, St. Mary Mead proceeded with its usual appearance of innocence. A cart passed along the lane. 2 women stopped outside the opposite gate, their voices too distant to hear, though their gestures conveyed perfectly the comfortable exchange of familiar news. A dog trotted by with the purposeful air of a creature attending to private business of importance. Mrs. Edith Carrington had been found in her chair by the window. There had been no sign of disturbance. Dr. Haydock had certified heart failure without hesitation, and Dr. Haydock was certainly not a foolish man. The village had accepted the news in the proper spirit. Sadness, respect, mild surprise, and the inevitable observation that poor dear Mrs. Carrington had never been strong. All of that was natural, entirely natural. And yet, Miss Marple resumed her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steadily, with a rhythm that soothed but did not distract. She was thinking of habits, of daily arrangements, of the way people expose their lives not through secrets, but through repetition. A woman always sitting in the same chair at the same hour, a cup placed on the same side table, a medicine bottle used according to instruction, a visitor expected on certain afternoons, a housemaid arriving at the same time each morning. Such things seemed trivial, until suddenly they were not. Miss Marple did not draw conclusions. She disapproved of premature conclusions almost as strongly as she disapproved of sloppy knitting. There was as yet no evidence of anything. There was only an incompleteness, a faint, persistent sense that the story of Mrs. Edith Carrington's quiet passing had closed too neatly. She set her knitting down at last and looked out at the garden. The October light was gilding the bare branches of the apple tree. It was beautiful, but beauty at that hour never lasted long. Already the shadows were lengthening beneath the hedges. The village was peaceful. The season was turning. And Miss Marple, who had seen many peaceful things conceal great disorder, found herself attending not to the dramatic but to the ordinary, for it was so often in the ordinary that the truth had hidden itself. Chapter 2. Another departure among familiar faces. There is a particular quality to a village in the days following a death. It is not grief precisely. Grief belongs to individuals and moves through hidden rooms of the heart where neighbours cannot follow. What settles over a village is something more diffuse, a lowering of voices at gates, a lengthening of pauses in shops, an unusual tenderness in inquiries after health. People speak gently, not always because they feel deeply, but because the presence of death reminds them that feeling may be required at any moment. St. Mary Mead, having considerable experience in such matters, passed through this period with its customary competence. Flowers were carried to the house, condolences were expressed. The question of Mrs. Carrington's sweet peas was raised with suitable concern, and resolved when young Thomas from the nursery agreed to tend them until the estate was settled. Various people remembered various virtues, her quietness, her kindness, her good sponge cake, her reliable attendance at church, her fondness for pale lavender gloves. Miss Marple observed all of it from her accustomed position in village life, and found it both admirable and instructive. A community reveals itself in the way it responds to loss. St. Mary Mead's response was, on the whole, a good one. There was affection in it, and not too much performance. Mrs. Carrington had been liked, and the village showed that it had liked her without becoming theatrical about it. The funeral took place on the Thursday at St. Bartholomew's. It was a quiet service conducted by the Reverend Clement with his usual mixture of doctrinal firmness and human gentleness. The church smelled faintly of damp stone, hymn books, and chrysanthemums. Thin autumn light slanted through the windows, falling across hats, shoulders, bowed heads and the dark polish of the coffin. Miss Marple attended, of course. She also observed. Mrs. Agnes Morrow sat in the front pew to the left. It was not quite a family position, but near enough to suggest the closest possible claim short of blood. She wore very good black, her hat modest but expensive, her gloves immaculate. Her face throughout the service carried an expression of composed sorrow, and the composition was so well managed that several people afterwards spoke of it with admiration. "She bore up wonderfully," Mrs. Morriman said in the churchyard. "Such dignity," said another lady. Miss Marple had noticed the stillness of Mrs. Morrow's hands. She had noticed, too, the slight tightening at the mouth when Mrs. Carrington's name was spoken aloud. Whether it was grief, effort, or something else, Miss Marple did not yet know. But she marked it. Miss Sylvia Trent sat farther back near the aisle. She wore grey rather than black, which was perhaps unconventional but entirely characteristic. Her presence was correct, restrained, and without decorative emotion. She did not appear unmoved. She appeared unwilling to pretend to any feeling she did not possess. That, Miss Marple thought, was a kind of honesty, though not always a comfortable one. After the service, Sylvia spoke briefly with Mr. Hennessy, the solicitor from Bursley, who had driven over for the occasion. The conversation was short. Sylvia listened, nodded once, asked what appeared to be a practical question, and departed with the brisk step of someone whose life contained tasks, and whose mourning, if any, would not interfere with them. Mr. Leonard Price stood near the yew tree during the committal. He was a thin, slightly stooped man in his early 70s, with a careful manner of movement, as though every physical action had first to be approved by the mind. Miss Marple had always associated such movements with people who had spent many years among documents, ledgers, legal phrases and figures, people trained to know that a small mistake could have consequences. His face was not unkind, but it was closed, not secretive exactly. Rather, it had the reserve of one who had learned that private thoughts were safest when kept private. As the mourners began to drift away from the grave, Miss Marple found herself walking beside him. "A sad day," she said gently. "Yes." Mr. Price held his hat in both hands. Mrs. Carrington was a very good woman. There was nothing remarkable in the words. People said such things at funerals because they were expected to. But after a moment he added, "She had a fine eye for small distinctions. We once disagreed for nearly 20 minutes over whether a postcard of Lyme Regis Harbour was printed before or after the pier railings were altered. She was quite right, as it happened." Miss Marple turned her head slightly. "You knew her through postcards, I believe." "Postcards and stamps, though more postcards in recent years. She liked places she had visited as a girl, Dorset especially." His mouth softened faintly. "She always gave visitors those lemon biscuits from Dorchester, ordered specially. She said ordinary village biscuits tasted of resignation." Miss Marple smiled. "That sounds very much like her." "She was a woman of very regular habits," Mr. Price said. "One always knew where one stood with her." The phrase, perfectly innocent in itself, remained with Miss Marple. People were often betrayed by the particular praise they chose for the dead. Some praised generosity because they had received it. Some praised cheerfulness because it had relieved them. Some praised discretion because they had required it. Mr. Price had praised regularity. Miss Marple walked home through the October lanes in a thoughtful frame of mind. The hedges were coppering at the edges. Damp leaves clung to the road. Somewhere a bonfire smoked behind a garden wall. She passed 2 school children arguing over conkers, Mrs. Price Ridley inspecting a tradesman's ladder with suspicion, and a cat washing itself on a gatepost with an air of moral superiority. Everything was ordinary, and yet the word regular remained. The following Tuesday morning Miss Marple was in her garden deadheading the last of the roses. It was a task she preferred to do herself when weather and joints permitted. There was something about the removal of what was spent that helped the mind to arrange what remained. She had just clipped a faded bloom and was considering whether the next bud had enough strength left to open when she heard footsteps approaching along the lane. They were hurried footsteps, though not youthful ones. A person in possession of news, but attempting to preserve dignity while carrying it. Miss Marple turned. Mrs. Dorothy Marmon was coming toward the gate with her shopping basket over one arm and an expression of compressed importance upon her face. Mrs. Marmon lived 3 doors along and had a gift, not uncommon in village life, for being present at the edges of events without ever seeming to seek them out deliberately. "Miss Marple," she called, stopping at the gate. "Have you heard about Mr. Price?" Miss Marple laid down her secateurs. Something within her became very still. "I have not," she said. "Tell me." There was little to tell, because facts, when stripped of conjecture, are often brief. Mr. Leonard Price had been found that morning by his landlady, Mrs. Goddard. She had gone to his rooms at 8 o'clock to collect his breakfast tray and discovered it untouched outside the sitting-room door. Receiving no answer when she knocked, she had entered. Mr. Price was in his armchair by the window, quite still. Dr. Haydock had been sent for. The circumstances, Mrs. Marmon reported in a lowered voice, were very similar to those of poor Mrs. Carrington. Peaceful attitude, no sign of distress, no disturbance in the room, no indication that anything had interrupted the quiet progress of an elderly man's day. "His heart, they think," Mrs. Marmon said. "He was not young after all, and Mrs. Goddard says he complained of tiredness last week." "I see," said Miss Marple. The words were mild. Her eyes were not. Mrs. Marmon, who had perhaps expected exclamation, alarm, or eager questioning, seemed faintly disappointed by Miss Marple's calm. "Very sad," she added. "Very," said Miss Marple. "Thank you, Mrs. Marmon." The other woman lingered a moment, as gossip sometimes does when it has not received the response it hoped for. Then she moved on, basket swinging, duty performed. Miss Marple remained at the garden gate. Her hand rested lightly on the latch. A leaf detached itself from the hedge and fell at her feet. Then she went inside, washed her hands and put the kettle on. She performed each action deliberately. She had learned that when the mind begins to move quickly, the hands should move slowly. Panic makes poor tea and worse deductions. Dolly Bantry arrived at 4 o'clock, drawn, as she often seemed to be, by the invisible current that carried village news toward Miss Marple's sitting room. She entered with apologies, settled herself in her usual chair, and arranged her coat about her with a slight fussiness that suggested she had brought more thoughts than she had yet put into order. "It is very sad," Dolly said at last. He had only just been at poor Edith's funeral, and now this. People are saying that attending a funeral can affect a person, remind them of their own age and frailty. And if he was not strong, perhaps the shock of it. She trailed off, dissatisfied even as she spoke. "People say a great many things," Miss Marple observed, pouring tea. "Some of them are even correct." Dr. Haydock seemed quite satisfied. Inspector Slack went round, apparently only as a matter of form. He made that quite clear. "Nothing suspicious," he said. "Natural causes. Quite plain." Inspector Slack said it was quite plain. Rather firmly, actually. Dolly paused. Though now that I say it aloud, I'm not entirely sure why he needed to say it firmly, since nobody had suggested anything else. "No," said Miss Marple. "Nobody had." She offered Dolly the biscuit tin. Outside, the late October light had begun its old trick of dimming and warming at the same time, so that the garden appeared briefly, falsely, almost like summer. The dahlias glowed. The brick path shone. Then a cloud crossed the sun, and the illusion vanished. "Twice," Miss Marple said after a while. Dolly looked up. "Twice. 2 deaths within a fortnight, both elderly, yes. Both apparently delicate, or at least not robust. Both found seated and alone. Both in peaceful attitudes. Both certified without difficulty. And both connected, however quietly, with the same small circle." Dolly was silent. She had known Miss Marple too long to dismiss such observations as casual. "But surely," she said carefully, "in a village this size, when the weather turns colder, people of a certain age—" "Yes," said Miss Marple. "It is not impossible. Indeed, in the ordinary way, it might not be remarkable at all. But you think it is? I think, said Miss Marple, that I keep returning to something Mr. Price said after Mrs. Carrington's funeral. What was that? He said she was a woman of very regular habits. One always knew where one stood with her. Dolly frowned slightly. That sounds harmless enough. Oh, entirely harmless, and meant as a compliment, I'm sure. But regular habits are curious things, useful things, revealing things. I am not sure I follow. Miss Marple placed her cup back in its saucer. People of very regular habits are predictable. One knows when they rise, when they eat, when they rest, when they receive visitors, when they are alone. One knows which chair they favour, which window they sit beside, which medicine they take, which tray will be left untouched until morning. Sometimes one knows these things as well as the person themselves. There was a long pause. The fire settled in the grate with a soft collapse of ash. And Mr. Price? Dolly asked slowly. Was he a man of regular habits? He worked for 30 years as a clerk in a solicitor's office in Dorchester, Miss Marple replied. I should think it very likely. Dolly stared into her tea. You cannot mean— I mean nothing yet. But you suspect something? Miss Marple considered this with the honesty she brought even to her own thoughts. I am saying, she replied at last, that twice is seldom without meaning, not always sinister meaning, sometimes merely human meaning, but meaning all the same. And before I allow myself to think anything definite, I should very much like to know a little more about the days preceding both of these quiet deaths. Dolly leaned back. The cheerful colour had faded somewhat from her face. Do you think they were connected? They were connected already, said Miss Marple gently. The question is whether the connection mattered. The room grew quiet. Outside, a robin landed on the garden wall. It may have been the same robin that had visited the bird table on the morning Dolly first brought news of Mrs. Carrington. Or perhaps not. Robins, like villagers, are often mistaken for one another by those who observe them carelessly. It looked through the window with bright, indifferent eyes, remained for 3 seconds, and flew away. Miss Marple watched it go. Then she reached for the teapot. More tea, Dolly? Chapter 3. Miss Marple catches a recurring habit. There is a kind of thinking that does not declare itself as thinking at all. It makes no dramatic entrance. It does not sit upright at a desk with sharpened pencils and a determined expression. It proceeds quietly, almost secretly, beneath the surface of ordinary life, gathering its small particles while one is occupied with matters that seem entirely unrelated. Pruning a rose bush, waiting for a kettle to boil, turning a heel in a piece of knitting, listening to the wireless with only half an ear. Miss Marple had long trusted this sort of thought. It was, in her experience, often more reliable than deliberate reasoning, which had an unfortunate habit of becoming over-neat. When one sat down firmly to think, one was apt to arrange the facts too soon, to give them a shape they had not yet earned, and sometimes, most dangerous of all, to find precisely the conclusion one had privately wished to find. So, in the days following her conversation with Dolly Bantry, Miss Marple did not force her mind. She went about her life in St. Mary Mead with the same gentle composure that had deceived many careless people into thinking her merely mild. She paid a call on old Mrs. Featherington, recently returned from a prolonged visit to her daughter in Wiltshire, and listened patiently while that lady required reassurance on several village developments which had occurred during her absence, and which, in her opinion, had all the appearance of moral decline. She attended the Thursday meeting of the Church Flower Committee, where the question of chrysanthemums for the November arrangements was debated with a seriousness that might have impressed the Foreign Office. She wrote 3 letters and received 2, one from her nephew Raymond, who was cheerful, affectionate and busy, and who still could not quite understand why anyone would choose to remain indefinitely in a small village when the world contained so many cities, galleries, scandals, and foreign restaurants. Miss Marple smiled over Raymond's letter, folded it neatly and put it aside. All the while, at the back of her mind, certain facts continued to shift. They did not yet form a pattern, not quite, but they touched one another from time to time as objects do in a drawer when the drawer is opened and closed. Mrs. Carrington in her chair, Mr. Price in his. 2 quiet deaths, 2 peaceful attitudes, 2 certificates signed without difficulty, 2 lives of regular habit, a small circle of acquaintances, a village accepting what it had been told because what it had been told was perfectly plausible. Plausibility, Miss Marple had often reflected, was one of the most useful disguises wickedness possessed. It was on Saturday morning while she was engaged in mending that the thing came to her. Mending was a particularly good occupation for thought. It required enough attention to keep the hands honest, but not so much that the mind was trapped. A tear in a seam, a frayed cuff, a loosened hem. These were problems of structure. If one followed the thread carefully enough, one saw where the weakness had begun. Miss Marple had just drawn her needle through a fine piece of linen when her hand stopped. The thought had arrived whole, not loudly, not with surprise. It had simply taken its place, as though it had been approaching for some time and had now reached the chair reserved for it. She laid down her sewing, folded her hands in her lap, and remained motionless for several moments. Then she rose, went to the writing desk in the corner of the sitting room, and opened the second drawer. Her notebook lay where it always lay, beneath a packet of envelopes and beside a small tin of sealing wax she no longer used but had never felt any reason to discard. She took it out and wrote 3 sentences in her small, clear hand. Then she read them back. They were not conclusions. Miss Marple disliked conclusions unsupported by sufficient fact. They were observations, and there is nothing more dangerous than an observation in the possession of someone who understands its proper weight. She closed the notebook, replaced it, and returned to her mending. What had finally arranged itself in her mind concerned the position of the hands. Miss Marple had not, of course, been present at either scene. She did not make a practice of appearing uninvited at houses where death had recently entered. It would have been intrusive. An intrusion, besides being socially undesirable, often made people defensive. But she had spoken with several people who had been present, and Miss Marple, though she rarely appeared to be doing more than listening kindly, was a listener of exceptional quality. She remembered not only what people said, but how they said it. She remembered hesitations, corrections, unnecessary explanations, words chosen and then withdrawn. She especially remembered the little details people offered, while believing they were saying something else entirely. Mrs. Goddard, Mr. Price's landlady, had come to tea on the Wednesday. She was not a close acquaintance of Miss Marple's, but she had arrived with the uncertain, seeking air of a woman who had experienced something disturbing and did not quite know what to do with it. She was stout, sensible, and in her late 50s, one of those women entirely competent in ordinary domestic emergencies and slightly lost when confronted with something that could not be scrubbed, folded, cooked, or put away. Miss Marple had received her kindly. Mrs. Goddard had talked for a long time, with the relief of someone who has at last been given permission to speak. She described the untouched breakfast tray, the closed sitting-room door, the silence after her knock, the moment of entering, and then, in the midst of these larger facts, she had mentioned a smaller one. "When I found him," Mrs. Goddard had said, turning her cup slowly in its saucer, "his right hand was in his lap, palm downward. It looked almost placed." She had paused after the word. "Not that I mean anything by that," she added quickly. "Not distressing, you know. He was not clutching at himself or anything of that sort. It was only that it struck me, just for a second. Then, of course, I thought, well, people do sit oddly sometimes, especially if they have fallen asleep." Then she'd moved on. But Miss Marple had not moved on. She had taken the word placed and put it carefully aside. A few days earlier, Miss Marple had also spoken briefly with young Mrs. Foster, the woman who came in to do for Mrs. Carrington. The conversation had taken place in the post office queue, where confidences, though technically public, often acquired a curious intimacy. Mrs. Foster was thin, nervous, and plainly not yet recovered from the shock of finding her employer dead. She answered questions in a distracted manner, as though part of her still stood in Mrs. Carrington's sitting room, unable to leave it. She had mentioned the chair by the window, the shawl, the stillness of the room, and then she said, almost as an afterthought, that Mrs. Carrington's left hand had been resting on the arm of the chair turned slightly outward. As if she were about to make a little gesture, Mrs. Foster had said, her brow tightening, only she had not finished it, if you see what I mean. Miss Marple had seen. Again the word had not been used, but the impression had been the same. Placed. That was the significant thing, not the individual detail. A hand may rest oddly for a dozen innocent reasons. People die in all manner of attitudes, and the human body is not obliged to arrange itself according to expectations. Taken alone, Mrs. Goddard's impression might have meant nothing. Taken alone, Mrs. Foster's uneasy recollection might have been the product of shock. But twice was different. 2 deaths. 2 separate households. 2 witnesses with no reason to compare accounts. 2 descriptions of hands that seemed not merely fallen, but arranged. Miss Marple was not a dramatic woman. She did not thrill at suspicion. Indeed, she found suspicion distasteful when it ran ahead of evidence, as it so often did in villages, where a lowered blind could become a scandal before lunchtime. But she had never believed that a repeated particular should be dismissed simply because it was small. Small things were often the only things people forgot to disguise. When Dolly came that Saturday afternoon, as Miss Marple had half expected she would, the tea was already prepared. Dolly had fallen into the habit of calling more often since Mr. Price's death, with the loyal instinct of an old friend who knew that something was being considered and wished, if possible, to be near the considering. Miss Marple waited until Dolly had removed her gloves, accepted tea, and taken a biscuit. Then she said, "I have been thinking." Dolly looked up at once. "Yes?" "About a detail mentioned to me by 2 people during the past week. Neither mentioned it with any particular emphasis. Indeed, I doubt either of them considered it important." Dolly put down her cup. "Mrs. Foster," Miss Marple continued, "found Mrs. Carrington with one hand resting in a position that struck her briefly as unusual. Mrs. Goddard found Mr. Price in a similar condition. In both cases, the nearest word to what was described is arranged." Dolly was silent. She had known Miss Marple long enough to understand that interrupting her at such a moment was rather like interrupting someone threading a needle. It might be possible, but it would not improve the result. "Now," Miss Marple said, choosing each word with gentle precision, "a person who has been unwell, who has felt faint or distressed, may certainly sit down and settle themselves. That is entirely natural. One may even die peacefully in one's chair. There is nothing impossible in that." "No," Dolly said softly, "but the body, when it is in distress, tends to obey distress. One leans forward, perhaps, or back, or to one side. One grips the arm of a chair. One lets the hand fall. There is often an awkwardness in it, even in peaceful death. Discomfort is not, as a rule, a tidy thing." Miss Marple glanced down at her own hands, folded lightly in her lap. What both witnesses described was tidiness. A hand placed rather than fallen. A position suggestive of repose, but perhaps only suggestive, as though someone had considered what peaceful death ought to look like and had arranged matters accordingly. Dolly exhaled very slowly. "Could it not be," she said, not argumentatively but honestly, "that some people do compose themselves? At the end, I mean. People of great calm or faith. I have heard of such things." "So have I," said Miss Marple readily. "And they happen. People may meet death with remarkable self-command. But it would be a curious coincidence for it to happen twice, in the same village, within a fortnight, to 2 people connected with the same small circle." Dolly looked into the fire. "And with the same person present in both households," she said quietly. Then she looked startled at herself, as though the words had emerged before she'd quite given them permission. Miss Marple's eyes rested on her with gentle approval. "I have not yet gone so far," she said, "but yes, that is the direction in which thought is naturally led." She reached for her knitting. This was often Miss Marple's way of indicating that a point had been reached and need not be hurried beyond itself. The needles began their soft, familiar clicking. "People do not usually compose themselves so neatly at the end," she said, more to herself than to Dolly. "Not unless they have had time, intention, and strength. And when a thing looks natural but is not natural, one must consider the possibility that someone has made it look so." The fire gave a comfortable settling sound. Outside, October deepened. The afternoon light had lost the fragile generosity of early autumn and taken on the firmer authority of the season's end. The hedges were darkening. The air beyond the window seemed cold and still, and the garden had that withdrawn look gardens acquire when they have begun to accept winter, before their owners have done so. Dolly gazed at the fire, then at Miss Marple. She had often experienced this sensation in her friend's sitting room, the feeling that Miss Marple was not guessing at random, nor being fanciful, but standing at an angle from which some larger pattern had begun to appear. Dolly herself could see only fragments, a hand, a cup, a name, a habit, but Miss Marple seemed to be watching the spaces between them. It was not frightening exactly, but it was no longer comfortable. "What will you do?" Dolly asked. Miss Marple's needles continued their quiet industry. "I shall pay a call," she said, "on one or two people, and I shall listen carefully to what they say." She looked up, and her expression was mild, almost serene, and, just as importantly, to what they do not say. Chapter 4. A teacup, set down on the wrong hand. Miss Marple had always believed that there was a great deal to be said for the simple act of paying a call. It was, in her view, one of the more underrated instruments of human understanding. A formal interview, such as policemen, solicitors, and other official persons conducted, had its uses, of course. But it also had its limitations. The very fact of being questioned made people cautious. They sat straighter, selected their words, arranged their memories, and presented not necessarily falsehoods, but edited versions of truth. A call was different. A neighbourly visit with its tea tray, its inquiries after health, its observations about weather, gardens, curtains, and village charities, created a gentler atmosphere. People lowered their guard because they did not believe they had raised it. They spoke in circles, and sometimes, in those circles, came unexpectedly close to the centre of things. Miss Marple chose her visits carefully. First, she wished to see the sitting room of Edith Carrington's house. It had not yet been cleared, the estate still being in the hands of Mr. Hennessy, and the practical business of dispersal remaining unresolved. Second, she wished to speak again with Miss Sylvia Trent, whose work on Mrs. Carrington's accounts had given her a particular sort of access to the household. Sylvia Trent's reserve was not likely to yield easily, but Miss Marple had often found that reserve, if approached correctly, might disclose more than chatter. The first visit presented a small difficulty. Miss Marple had no obvious claim upon Mrs. Carrington's house. She solved this difficulty in the manner she solved many social obstacles, by making use of something perfectly true and not especially important. Mrs. Agnes Morrow, as Mrs. Carrington's closest friend, had been given informal charge of the property until the estate was settled. To Mrs. Morrow, Miss Marple wrote a brief and pleasant note. She expressed the hope that she might call and collect a small volume she believed she had once lent Mrs. Carrington, a slim collection of verse by a minor Georgian poet. Miss Marple had not missed the book in years, and was not entirely certain she had ever lent it at all, but the possibility was sufficient and socially acceptable. Mrs. Morrow replied warmly and promptly as Miss Marple had expected. On the following Monday morning, a pale, still day with a coldness not yet severe but plainly intending to become so, Miss Marple made her way to the Carrington house. Mrs. Morrow admitted her herself. She was wearing a practical apron over a dark dress and had clearly been engaged in some gentle sorting. There was nothing hurried in her manner, nothing possessive, nothing that would have seemed improper to anyone less attentive than Miss Marple. She appeared exactly what she was widely believed to be: helpful, considerate, saddened, and competent. The house had that particular quietness which belongs to a dwelling recently emptied of its owner. It was not the silence of abandonment, it was more intimate than that. A house lived in for many years does not become vacant immediately upon death. It retains habits. The angle of a chair, the fading of a carpet before the hearth, a shawl folded over the same rail, a faint scent in the hall, all these continue to say someone has been here long after the person herself has gone. The hall smelled of dried flowers, beeswax polish, and something faintly medicinal beneath it. The sitting room, when they entered it, was comfortable, faded, and orderly. It was the sort of room that had not changed much in 20 years, because its owner had not seen why it should. The curtains were of a deep green damask, handsome though somewhat old-fashioned. The fire grate was clean. The bookshelf along the wall held its volumes in almost military alignment. A small writing desk beneath the window was clear of papers. Too clear, perhaps. But Mrs. Carrington had been a tidy woman. It would not do to make mysteries out of every polished surface. Mrs. Morrow moved about with the ease of someone familiar with the room. She spoke of Mrs. Carrington with warm fluency, recalling small kindnesses, preferred flowers, shared walks, and the particular way Edith had of saying, "Well, perhaps," when she meant no such thing. Her grief, if grief it was, had been arranged into usefulness. She had lists to make, drawers to sort, people to consult. Sorrow became her occupation, and she performed it well. "Do sit down, Miss Marple," she said. "I will bring tea. Edith would never have forgiven me if I let anyone sit in her house without tea." Miss Marple smiled and accepted. Left alone for a minute, she looked around the room with the mild, appreciative gaze of an elderly lady admiring domestic comfort. She missed nothing. Mrs. Carrington's chair was easily recognised. It stood angled toward the window, the upholstery slightly worn at the arms, the cushion pressed into the shape of long use. Beside it, on the right, stood a small table. On that table was a saucer. In the saucer rested a teacup. Miss Marple's eyes paused. The cup was set slightly to the left of the saucer's centre, its handle angled inward. Nothing. To most people. Less than nothing. A teacup imperfectly placed. But Miss Marple had been thinking about habits. The table stood to the right of the chair. Mrs. Carrington, as several people had mentioned at various times over the years, had been distinctly right-handed. Indeed, Miss Marple remembered her once saying at the Church Flower Committee that she could not imagine how left-handed people managed arrangements without turning everything into confusion. A right-handed woman seated in that chair, reaching naturally to the table on her right, would lift her cup and set it down with the handle inclined to the right. There would be no reason to twist the wrist, no reason to shift the cup across the saucer, no reason for that inward leftward angle. For the cup to rest as it did, one of two things seemed likely. Either Mrs. Carrington had made an awkward movement quite unlike her usual habit, or another hand had placed it there. Miss Marple did not move closer. She did not touch the cup. She merely noted it. Mrs. Morrow returned with a tea tray assembled with practised ease, cups, milk, sugar, thin biscuits, and a small plate of seed cake. She knew Mrs. Carrington's kitchen well. Too well? Miss Marple did not allow the thought to become a conclusion. The conversation settled pleasantly. They spoke first of Mrs. Carrington's garden. Mrs. Morrow hoped very properly that it might be kept in order until the house was sold or otherwise disposed of. They spoke of the cold, and whether the winter would prove as sharp as the previous one. They spoke of the forthcoming bring and buy sale in the village hall, which Mrs. Morrow had agreed to help organise, and about which she expressed the tentative enthusiasm of someone grateful for a respectable occupation. Miss Marple admired the curtains. "They are very handsome," she said. "Such a deep green. One does not often see that particular shade now." "Edith's sister made them," Mrs. Morrow replied. 30 years ago, at least. Edith would never replace them. She said good fabric should be allowed to justify itself. "A very sensible view." Mrs. Morrow smiled. After a suitable pause, Miss Marple allowed her gaze to rest gently on the room as a whole. "She was very particular about her sitting room, was she not?" she said. "Everything had its place. One always felt that." "Oh, very." Mrs. Morrow's voice warmed. "Edith had a place for everything and was quite firm about it. She once rearranged a shelf of mine while taking tea, because she said the order of the volumes would trouble her if she left them as they were." She laughed softly, with what seemed genuine affection. "She was not interfering, you understand. She simply could not help noticing. A quality I find entirely sympathetic," Miss Marple said. Then, without any alteration in tone, she glanced toward the little table. "I notice the cup has been left. Shall I move it, do you think, or is it best to leave things exactly as they are for the present?" Mrs. Morrow looked toward the cup. For a second her face was blank, merely polite. "Oh, I should think it can stay. The girl is coming in on Thursday to do a general tidy. She set it on the left-hand side, I notice," Miss Marple said. "Or rather, it appears so from here. I should have thought, given the position of the table, that Mrs. Carrington would have placed it more naturally to the right." There it was. A very small alteration passed across Mrs. Morrow's expression. It was not alarm. It was not guilt. It was not anything so definite or useful. It was no more than a swift internal rearrangement, the look of someone who has unexpectedly encountered a fact and in the same instant chosen how to meet it. "She may have moved it herself at some point," Mrs. Morrow said pleasantly. "She sometimes shifted things about in the evening when she was reading." "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple. Her agreement was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, for Mrs. Morrow's comfort. They spoke for several minutes more. The Georgian poetry volume was looked for and not found, which Miss Marple accepted without disappointment. She took her leave with gratitude, praised Mrs. Morrow's kindness, and walked back through the pale morning with the image of the cup clear in her mind. A cup, a hand, a peaceful attitude, a room tidied after death. Miss Sylvia Trent proved a different experience altogether. She received Miss Marple on the Thursday afternoon in her cottage at the eastern edge of the village. The house was small, compact, and very well ordered. It reflected its owner with almost startling fidelity. There were no unnecessary ornaments, no sentimental objects displayed for conversation, no clutter disguised as comfort. Every chair had purpose. Every shelf seemed to have been considered. Even the fire burned efficiently. Miss Trent herself offered tea with brisk correctness. If hospitality was to be given, she plainly intended that it should be given properly. She sat opposite Miss Marple, back straight, hands still, eyes direct. They spoke of Mrs. Carrington's accounts. Miss Trent was discreet, as Miss Marple had expected. She confirmed only what was already known or harmless, that the estate was straightforward, that Mr. Hennessy was competent, that there were no significant complications, that Mrs. Carrington had kept her affairs in unusually good order for a woman who disliked figures. She did not enjoy accounts, Sylvia said, but she respected them. There is a difference. A very important one, Miss Marple said. Sylvia inclined her head. She had clearly decided in advance what it was proper to say, and she did not cross that boundary. There was nothing evasive in it. It was more like a wall built for good reasons and maintained without apology. Miss Marple found this interesting. Reserve, when natural, had its own honesty, but it also meant that what slipped through it was often worth noticing. They spoke of the day Mrs. Foster found Mrs. Carrington. Miss Trent said she had gone to the house that morning on business. There had been a small discrepancy in one of Mrs. Carrington's household accounts. Nothing serious, merely a figure copied incorrectly. She had intended to clarify it. When I arrived, Sylvia said, Mrs. Foster was on the front step, very distressed. She had come out of the house and had not yet been able to make herself go back in. That must have been upsetting. It was unpleasant, said Sylvia, for her especially. There was a pause. Then Sylvia added, not with emphasis, but as though the memory had presented itself and required acknowledgement. There was a cup on the table. I remember noticing it. Miss Marple waited. It was on the left side of the saucer, Sylvia continued, or angled that way. Edith was always very particular. I thought at the time that someone must have moved it. Someone? Sylvia's eyes met hers, or that it had been moved. Perhaps by Mrs. Foster, perhaps by Dr. Haydock. I did not inquire. No, Miss Marple said. One would hardly think to do so at such a time. Exactly. Sylvia's voice closed the matter, but not before the matter had entered the room. Miss Marple looked down at her hands. People are creatures of habit, she said, even in very small things. Miss Trent regarded her steadily. Her face gave little away, but her eyes had sharpened. Yes, she said, they are. There was no more to be gained then. Miss Marple knew it. Sylvia Trent was not a woman to be pushed. A direct question would meet a direct answer, and very likely an unhelpful one. More than that, it would alert her to the shape of Miss Marple's interest. So Miss Marple finished her tea, remarked on the neatness of the garden path, and took her leave. The walk home was brisk and cold. The sky had lowered during the afternoon, and the hedges on either side of the lane seemed darker than they had in the morning. Somewhere beyond the cottages a dog barked once and fell silent. Smoke rose straight from chimneys, which meant the air was still, and still air in autumn often made sound seem unnaturally clear. Miss Marple walked slowly. 2 witnesses, 2 households. In each, a small displaced detail. A hand that seemed arranged. A cup that did not sit where habit would have placed it. Mrs. Morrow's face for one unguarded fraction of a second, altering itself before resuming its proper expression. And Sylvia Trent. Cool, precise Sylvia Trent, who had noticed the same thing and chosen not to make too much of it. It was not evidence. Miss Marple was too honest to call it that. It was not even accusation. But it had shape. And Miss Marple had learned over many years that truth often appeared first not as certainty, but as shape. A faint outline beneath a cloth, a pressure in the air, a repeated irregularity where regularity ought to have been. By the time she reached her gate, the light was already fading. She paused before entering, looking back along the lane toward the village. St. Mary Mead lay quiet under the deepening October sky, its windows beginning to glow, its chimneys smoking, its curtains drawn against the cold. Nothing stirred that should not stir. Nothing appeared out of place. And yet, somewhere within that careful quiet, someone had made a mistake. A very small mistake. The kind Miss Marple trusted most. Chapter 5. A purse fastened a little too carefully. Miss Marple had a theory about handbags. Or more accurately, she had a theory about what handbags revealed. It was not the sort of theory one could present before a learned society, nor would Miss Marple have dreamed of doing so. It was not supported by statistics, diagrams, or any formal method of proof. It belonged instead to that quiet body of knowledge acquired by a woman who had spent a great many years watching a great many people and had noticed that personal belongings often told the truth long after their owners had ceased trying to. A handbag, she believed, was an especially revealing object. A sitting room might be arranged for visitors. A desk might be cleared before company arrived. A mantelpiece might present to the world a careful selection of photographs, ornaments, and respectable memories. But a handbag was different. A handbag was private territory. It was used hurriedly, repeatedly, unconsciously. It was opened and closed in moments of impatience, anxiety, routine, irritation, and absent-mindedness. It contained the small necessities of a person's day, and more importantly, it reflected the manner in which that person approached those necessities. There were tidy handbags and chaotic handbags, practical handbags and sentimental handbags, handbags that contained old receipts, boiled sweets, prayer cards, safety pins, letters, loose coins, spectacles, railway timetables, pills, keys, and secrets. The arrangement was seldom meant to be seen, and for that very reason it was often honest. A handbag, Miss Marple thought, revealed the owner not as she wished to appear, but as she was when no one was watching. She was thinking of this as she made her way along Vicarage Lane on Tuesday morning, carrying a small pot of greengage preserve she had put up in August. The preserve served as her reason for calling on Mrs. Goddard, though not, of course, her only reason. Mrs. Goddard received her with the slightly overwhelmed gratitude of a woman who'd been visited more in the past fortnight than in the preceding 3 years, and who had not yet decided whether this sudden attention reflected her own importance or merely the importance of the death that had taken place beneath her roof. She was, as Miss Marple had observed before, a sensible woman, practical by temperament and honest in speech. But Mr. Price's death had unsettled her. She remained in that heightened state which sometimes follows a shock when the mind, unable to rest, keeps returning to details it had first tried to dismiss. Such people often speak more than they intend, not because they are indiscreet, but because something inside them is asking to be put in order. Mrs. Goddard made tea. Miss Marple accepted it with every appearance of that being the true purpose of her visit. The greengage preserve was admired, opened, tasted, and pronounced excellent. The weather was discussed with proper seriousness. The condition of the lane was condemned. The question of Mr. Price's rooms arose cautiously, as it was bound to do. Mrs. Goddard needed the income from them, but grief and practicality make awkward companions, and she had not yet felt able to speak of finding another lodger, except in the most indirect way. "His things are still there, of course," Mrs. Goddard said, wrapping both hands around her cup. "Mr. Hennessy will come to see about them, I suppose. He had no close family. A cousin in Lincolnshire, I believe, but they had not corresponded for years. It is sad when one thinks about it. A whole life contained in 2 rooms, and no one very near to come and say, 'This was his.'" "He was not a man who formed many attachments," Miss Marple said gently. "But those he did form seem to have been genuine." Mrs. Goddard nodded. "He was particular about everything. His rooms were always neat. Not fussy, you understand. It was not that he was forever dusting or complaining. He simply knew where things belonged and preferred them to remain there. I used to say to my sister that I had never had a lodger give me so little trouble. He was entirely self-sufficient." She paused. Then she added in a different voice, "That is why it seems strange." Miss Marple looked up from her tea. "Strange?" The word was spoken mildly, not eagerly, certainly not as though she had been waiting for it. Mrs. Goddard seemed to hesitate. Then some private decision moved within her, and she leaned forward slightly. "When I found him, everything in the room was as it always was, perfectly tidy, perfectly in order." She stopped. "Except the handbag." Miss Marple said nothing. Silence, she had found, was frequently the most useful response in the world. "He always kept it on the little table by the door," Mrs. Goddard continued. "Every morning when I came in it was there, open. He had a habit of leaving it open because he was always putting things in and taking things out. His timetable, his reading glass, his correspondence. Little notes he made to himself." A small fond smile crossed her face. "He used to say that a closed handbag in the morning was an invitation to inefficiency." "A very precise observation," Miss Marple murmured. "That was Mr. Price all over." Mrs. Goddard's smile faded. "But when I found him, the bag was not on the table. It was on his lap, closed, fastened properly. The clasp was pressed right down." She searched for the word. "It looked very neat." Miss Marple's eyes remained kind and steady. "And this struck you as unusual?" "At the time I told myself it was nothing. I thought perhaps he had felt unwell and reached for the bag. Perhaps there was something inside he thought he might need." Mrs. Goddard set down her cup carefully. "But if you reach for something in a hurry because you feel ill, you do not fasten the clasp properly afterwards, do you? You would leave it open, or half open, or dropped. You would not press the clasp down as though you were putting it away for the night. No, said Miss Marple quietly, you would not. There was a pause. Not an empty pause, but the kind that occurs when two people have reached the same conclusion from different paths and are now standing together before it. I should not like to be the sort of person who sees difficulties where there are none, Mrs. Goddard said at last. Her voice was careful, almost apologetic. Dr. Haydock was satisfied. Inspector Slack said there was nothing to question. I am not a fanciful woman, Miss Marple. No, said Miss Marple, you are not fanciful. You're observant. That is a very different thing, and in my experience a much more valuable one. Mrs. Goddard appeared both reassured and alarmed, as people often are when their private uneasiness is confirmed by someone they respect. Miss Marple let the reassurance settle before she spoke again. Do you remember whether Mr. Price had any visitors in the days before he died? Anyone who called at the house? Mrs. Goddard considered. He was not in the habit of having many visitors. Occasionally someone came about the postcard correspondence, though I could not always say who. He exchanged things with one or two people locally. Mrs. Morrow called once or twice, which I thought kind of her. She had been to see him after Mrs. Carrington's death. Natural enough, since they both knew her. Mrs. Morrow called here? Miss Marple kept her voice perfectly neutral. At least once that I know of, possibly twice. Mrs. Goddard frowned slightly. I mentioned it to her afterwards, when she came to hear how he had been keeping. She said she thought it right to look in on him, since they had both lost a mutual friend. I see. Though now that you raise it... Mrs. Goddard's frown deepened. I am not entirely certain she mentioned the second visit. It may only have slipped her mind. Very possibly, said Miss Marple. One doesn't always remember every call one makes, particularly during a period of general upset. No, said Mrs. Goddard, but she did not sound convinced. They moved after that to other subjects. The Green Gage Preserve was returned to and praised again. The public footpath at the end of the lane was discussed with some severity. A mutual acquaintance's recently acquired dog, of uncertain temper and worse manners, received a fair share of criticism. Miss Marple left at 11:45, with Mrs. Goddard's warm and slightly exhausted thanks following her to the door. The poor woman had said more than she had intended. Whether that left her relieved or more disturbed, she did not yet seem to know. Walking home along Vicarage Lane, Miss Marple thought about what it meant to close something that ought to have been open. A bag on a table, normally left open every morning. A bag found on a dead man's lap. Closed. Fastened. The clasp pressed firmly down. A man who felt sudden weakness might reach for a bag. He might fumble for spectacles, medicine, paper, or some object of comfort, but he would not, having done so, close and fasten it with careful precision. Illness did not create unnecessary neatness. Fear did not press clasps firmly shut, but another person might. A person standing in that quiet room after death had already occurred. A person looking around and seeing not a man but a scene. A person concerned with the appearance of naturalness. A person to whom an open bag looked untidy, suggestive, wrong, and who therefore closed it. Too carefully. That was the mistake. It was the same instinct, Miss Marple thought, that had placed the hands. The instinct of someone orderly. Someone who believed in composed surfaces. Someone accustomed to arranging rooms, people, emotions, duties, perhaps even grief itself, into acceptable form. Someone who might not understand that over-arrangement was as revealing as disorder. To do something more carefully than one's own nature required was often to reveal interference, and to make another person's belongings tidier than that person would ever have made them was to leave behind the trace of a different character. Mr. Price had not fastened that clasp. Somebody else had. The cold had sharpened while Miss Marple had been indoors. The lane lay still beneath a pale sky. From a chimney beyond the roofs, a thin column of smoke rose perfectly straight in the windless air. Miss Marple paused for a moment to watch it. There was something almost instructive about that column of smoke, a straight line rising without deviation, cause to consequence, action to result. She walked on. She would speak to Dolly in the afternoon. Then she must think very carefully about Mrs. Agnes Morrow, not merely about what she had done, if indeed she had done anything, but about what kind of secret might require such attentive management, and what it might have cost two quiet, harmless people to come too close to it. Chapter 6. The Garden Seat. Facing the front gate. There is a particular kind of late October afternoon that does not feel melancholy so much as final. The light hangs low and grey. The air carries a faint mineral sharpness, as though the earth itself has cooled and hardened. Gardens, stripped of their summer generosity, have been reduced to structure. Dark hedges, bare rose canes, the black ribs of trees, the last stubborn colour of a few flowers that have not yet accepted the season's verdict. Miss Marple found such afternoons bracing. They had the quality of a plain statement clearly made, and she had always respected plain statements, especially when they came without ornament. She was standing once again at the window of Mrs. Carrington's sitting room. Mrs. Morrow had shown no surprise at the second visit. Miss Marple's explanation, that there might have been another mislaid volume, a companion to the first, had been received with smooth cordiality. Mrs. Morrow did not believe it. Miss Marple was almost certain of that. But Mrs. Morrow was far too well bred and too socially skilled to say so. Instead, she admitted Miss Marple warmly, spoke of the unfortunate chill in the air, and suggested tea after they had looked once more for the missing book. Now Miss Marple stood by the sitting-room window and looked out at the garden. It was not a large garden. It had the sensible proportions of village houses of that age, enough to give pleasure, not so much as to become an oppression to a woman of uncertain health. It had been arranged by someone with firm preferences and limited energy, a narrow flagged path from the back door to the gate, a herbaceous border along the south wall, a small apple tree, a rectangle of lawn, and a modest patch where sweet peas had once climbed in summer. Now the border had been cut back to brown stalks and damp earth. The apple tree stood leafless, a few darkened fruits lying forgotten in the grass below. The path was slightly green at the edges with autumn damp, and there, a little to one side of the flagged path, stood a wooden garden chair. It was the sort of chair that spent summers outside and winters in a shed. This one had evidently been overlooked in the general autumn retreat, perhaps because the sudden death of its owner had interrupted the ordinary sequence of household tasks. Miss Marple looked at it for a long time. The chair had not merely been left out, it had been positioned. It stood at a deliberate angle facing directly toward the back gate. Anyone sitting there would have had a clear view of the gate. More than that, anyone entering through the gate would have seen the seated person immediately. Mrs. Morrow came to stand beside her, following Miss Marple's gaze with the attentive sociability of a hostess who notices where a guest's interest has settled. "Poor Edith's garden," she said softly. "She was so particular. About it. I shall make sure someone comes to put it properly to rights before winter sets in." "The chair," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I wonder whether Edith often sat outside at this time of year." "She loved her garden," Mrs. Morrow replied. "Though by October she usually preferred to enjoy it from indoors. She felt the cold rather badly in recent years." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "I should have thought so." She continued looking at the chair. "It is facing the gate." Mrs. Morrow glanced out. "So it is." "I'd always rather imagined she preferred sitting toward the apple tree. It has a lovely shape, even without its leaves." Mrs. Morrow considered this with the air of seeing the point for the first time. "I believe she did, usually. The gate faces north, and the light from that direction is not good in the afternoon." She paused lightly. "Perhaps she moved it at some point. Or one of the neighbours' children shifted it fetching a ball. They do sometimes come over the gate." "Quite possibly," said Miss Marple. The answer was gentle and therefore revealed nothing. She turned from the window, and Mrs. Morrow, with admirable social fluency, moved the conversation toward Mrs. Carrington's sister in Derbyshire, who was elderly and would find it difficult to travel for the eventual dispersal of the estate. Mr. Hennessy, Mrs. Morrow said, had been most kind and had offered to conduct as much as possible by correspondence. Miss Marple listened. She made the appropriate remarks. She accepted another cup of tea. Very little she'd learned was wasted in this life, including tea. But she continued to think about the chair. A woman who felt the cold, and who generally preferred to view her garden from the sitting-room window in October, did not sit outside without reason. A chair facing a tree was for pleasure. A chair facing a gate was for expectation. The most natural explanation was that Mrs. Carrington had been waiting for someone to arrive. More precisely, she wished either to see the person before he or she reached the house, or to be seen by that person at once. Perhaps the meeting had been arranged. Perhaps the garden had been chosen deliberately. Less formal than the sitting-room, less intimate, more easily entered and left. A garden conversation had a different quality from an indoor one. It could suggest ease or caution. The back gate, Miss Marple remembered, opened onto the narrow service lane running behind the row of houses. It was used by dustmen, tradesmen, children retrieving balls, and anyone who wished to come and go without being noticed from the front street. A casual caller used the front door. A familiar caller, or a caller with a reason not to be seen, might use the back gate. Miss Marple thought of what Mrs. Goddard had said, that Mrs. Morrow had called on Mr. Price at least once, possibly twice, and that the second visit had not been clearly acknowledged. She thought too of what Mrs. Morrow had said about Mrs. Carrington's last days, and what she had not said. The back lane was convenient, very convenient. After a pause, Miss Marple turned back from the window. "You have been so good to everyone," she said warmly, "since Edith's passing, looking after the house, writing to Mr. Hennessy, calling on Mrs. Goddard, thinking of Mr. Price. It must have been quite exhausting, managing other people's distress as well as your own." Mrs. Morrow accepted this with modest grace. One does what one can. It seemed only right when one was in a position to help. Edith was very dear to me. And you and Leonard Price were friendly, beyond your connection through her. "We were acquainted," Mrs. Morrow said. "He was a quiet man, reserved as you know, but Edith valued him, and that was quite sufficient for me." There was a pause, not long, not obvious, but present. "I was very sorry to hear of his passing," Mrs. Morrow added. "So close after hers, it seemed very hard." "You'd seen him recently, I believe. Mrs. Goddard mentioned a visit." Something crossed Mrs. Morrow's face. It was not discomfort. She was far too controlled for discomfort to show itself plainly. It was a smaller thing, an inward adjustment, the delicate rearrangement of a response before it was allowed to appear. "I called briefly after Edith's funeral," she said. "It seemed the neighbourly thing to do. They had been friends for years. I thought he might feel the loss more deeply than he would admit. He was not a man who spoke readily, but one can sometimes tell." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "And was he much affected?" "He seemed thoughtful." Mrs. Morrow smiled faintly, as though acknowledging the word's limitations but finding no better one. "He asked one or two questions about Edith's last days, whether I had seen her frequently, whether she had seemed herself, that sort of thing. One asks such questions when trying to settle the shape of a loss. What sort of questions precisely?" It was more direct than Miss Marple usually chose to be at this stage. She watched Mrs. Morrow receive it as one might watch still water receive a small stone. "Oh," Mrs. Morrow said with a slight vagueness that arrived a fraction too late to be natural. Whether she had seemed well in herself toward the end, whether she had been troubled by anything. I told him she had been very much her usual self, peaceful, content. It appeared to reassure him. "Mr. Price was a thorough man," Miss Marple said, "a clerk by profession. I imagine he had a tidy mind." "Very tidy," said Mrs. Morrow. There was something in her voice now, not affection, not dislike, something more complicated. the tone of a person speaking of a quality she has had reason to consider carefully. Miss Marple set down her cup. She looked again toward the garden, the stripped border, the forgotten apples, the wooden chair turned toward the gate with the patient fixity of an object that cannot be talked into moving. Expectation, she said, almost to herself, often reveals more than action. "I beg your pardon?" Mrs. Morrow asked. "I was thinking," Miss Marple said pleasantly, "that the chair suggests Edith was expecting someone that afternoon. It is the sort of thing one does when one has arranged a meeting. One makes oneself easy to find." She smiled with mild innocence. "Do you know if she was expecting anyone?" The pause this time was fractionally longer. "Not that I am aware of," Mrs. Morrow said. "She did not mention it to me." "No," said Miss Marple, "of course not." She did not press the point. Pressure, applied too soon, hardened people. Miss Marple preferred to let silence do its own patient work. She took her leave shortly afterward with genuine appreciation. Mrs. Morrow's tea was excellent, and her biscuits were better than those sold at the village shop, a fact Miss Marple had often privately observed and never publicly announced. They parted at the front door with cordial ease. Two women who understood one another perfectly in the social sense, and perhaps in one or two others besides. Walking home, Miss Marple turned the afternoon over in her mind as one turns a piece of fabric to examine the reverse. The chair positioned toward the back gate, Mrs. Morrow's acknowledged visit to Mr. Price, the possible second visit, unmentioned, the questions Mr. Price had asked in his thorough clerk's way about Edith Carrington's last days. Had she seemed troubled? Had she been herself? Had anything occurred? He had been doing, Miss Marple thought, something very like what she herself was doing now, quietly asking, quietly comparing, quietly noticing that one fact did not fit comfortably beside another. And a few days later he had been found in his armchair, his hands composed, his bag closed too neatly, and the appearance of peaceful, natural death arranged around him like a well-laid table. A tidy man with a tidy mind, a man who had noticed something, a man who may have allowed the wrong person to understand that he had noticed it. Miss Marple walked at her usual measured pace. The afternoon was grey, cold and conclusive, and she felt it had told her a great deal. Not enough yet to accuse, enough to proceed. What remained was to arrange what she knew into a form that could be communicated, not merely felt, not merely inferred, but demonstrated with patience and care. The dead deserved that. So did the living, even those among the living who might not deserve very much else. She would speak to Dolly in the morning, and then, she thought, it might be time, though the thought carried a certain weight, to speak to someone with rather more authority than Dolly Bantry. Chapter 7. A caller no one spoke about. Inspector Slack had a particular expression which appeared on his face whenever Miss Marple came to speak to him about something. It was not exactly dismissive. There had been a time, years earlier, when Inspector Slack had considered Miss Marple a harmless elderly lady, with a gift for gossip and a rather irritating habit of being right. Experience had corrected that view several times. His professional vanity was substantial, but it was not wholly immune to evidence. He had learned, though not always willingly, that when Miss Marple brought him a matter, it was generally unwise to dismiss it before hearing the whole. Still, the expression remained. It was the look of a man who had built for himself a perfectly serviceable understanding of how the world worked, and found it inconvenient when an elderly spinster with knitting needles complicated it. It sat on his face like a hat worn slightly crooked, technically in place, but suggesting a certain disturbance beneath. He received her in the small office at the back of the police station. The room smelled, as it always did, of typewriter ribbon, old paper, damp overcoats, and the particular brand of tobacco favoured by his sergeant. A metal filing cabinet stood against one wall. A calendar hung slightly askew on another. On the desk before him lay a pad, a pen, and several documents arranged with the determined neatness of a man who was not naturally neat. but wished to appear so. "Good morning, Miss Marple," Inspector Slack said. "Good morning, Inspector." He offered her the chair opposite his desk with brisk courtesy, the kind that suggested he hoped the visit would be brief. Miss Marple, who had no intention of being brief but was perfectly willing to allow him the comfort of hoping so, settled herself with unhurried composure. She placed her bag on her lap, folded her gloved hands upon it, and began. She did not begin with accusation. That, she knew, would have been a mistake. Instead, she told him what she had observed and what she had heard, in the order in which it had come to her. Not the dramatic order which begins with suspicion and moves backward to justify it, but the honest order, the order of accumulation, hesitation, recurrence, and pattern. First, Mrs. Carrington's death, then Mr. Price's, the similarity of the circumstances, the quiet rooms, the peaceful attitudes, the certificates issued without difficulty, then the hands. Mrs. Foster's description of Mrs. Carrington's hand turned outward slightly as though a gesture had been arranged but not completed. Mrs. Goddard's recollection of Mr. Price's right hand resting palm downward in his lap, too deliberate, too composed. Then the cup, a teacup set to the wrong side in the sitting room of a right-handed woman whose habits were, by all accounts, precise. Then the handbag, Mr. Price's bag, usually open each morning, found closed and fastened on his lap with unusual exactness. Then the garden chair, a chair left outside in late October, facing not the apple tree, not the sun, but the back gate. And finally the visits, those acknowledged in part, those left uncertain, those perhaps omitted because omission seems safer than explanation. Inspector Slack listened. To his credit, he listened properly. Not at first, perhaps. At first he listened with that professional patience policemen keep for elderly ladies, bereaved relatives, and people who have seen suspicious strangers who turn out to be postmen. But gradually his expression altered. The irritation did not disappear exactly, but it was joined by attention. He took up his pen. That, Miss Marple considered, was encouraging. When she had finished, she sat quietly and allowed the silence to remain. She did not decorate her case with urgency. She had said what needed saying. Silence, properly used, could be quite as persuasive as speech. Inspector Slack tapped his pen once against the pad. "You understand," he said at last, "that all this is circumstantial." "In the technical sense, yes," said Miss Marple. "I understand perfectly. I mean, none of it proves anything." "No," said Miss Marple, "not by itself. I am not suggesting that it constitutes proof. I am suggesting that it constitutes a pattern, and a pattern, Inspector, deserves to be looked at rather more carefully than these two deaths have so far been looked at." Slack frowned. "Dr. Haydock certified both deaths." "He did. He is not an incautious man." "No," Miss Marple agreed warmly. "He's a very good doctor, and, in both cases, he had every reason, from what was presented to him, to reach the conclusion he reached." Slack looked at her sharply. "Presented to him?" Miss Marple's expression remained mild. "If one is shown a natural death, tidily arranged, one sees a natural death. That, I think, is precisely the difficulty. The arrangement was designed to be seen and accepted, and it was accepted." Inspector Slack's fingers tightened slightly around the pen. "The first death," Miss Marple continued, "gave no particular reason for doubt. Mrs. Carrington was not young. She was delicate. She had a weak heart. No one had reason to question it. But the second death alters the nature of the first. One isolated event may be coincidence. Two events of the same character, touching the same small circle, require greater care." Slack did not answer at once. Miss Marple could see the point had reached him. She could also see that he disliked being reached. "Mrs. Morrow," he said finally, testing the name as one might test the strength of a bridge, "is a well-regarded woman. Yes. She has lived in the village for, 15 years? She came when her husband was still alive. He died 9 years ago. She has been a widow since. And she has maintained herself very respectably." "Very respectably," said Miss Marple. "Quietly, too." very quietly. Slack gave a small nod, as if that settled something. Miss Marple looked at him with perfect gentleness. That is precisely what interests me, Inspector. She has maintained herself carefully, very carefully, and it is often carefulness, rather than disorder, that reveals where one ought to look. There was another pause. This one was less comfortable than the first. What exactly are you asking me to do? Slack said. Only to make inquiries, Miss Marple replied. Quiet ones, nothing dramatic, nothing that would cause unnecessary distress if I am entirely mistaken. And if you're not, then quiet inquiries will be the right beginning. Inspector Slack leaned back in his chair. Miss Marple continued, her voice still gentle, still precise. I should like to know whether there is anything in the background of Mrs. Carrington, or Mr. Price, that might explain why their continued existence could have become inconvenient to Mrs. Morrow, and I should like to know whether Mrs. Morrow's movements on the relevant evenings can be accounted for. Slack watched her for a long moment. Miss Marple returned the look with the calm patience of someone accustomed to waiting for people to catch up with uncomfortable truths. At last he said, I'll make some inquiries. Thank you. Quietly, he added, with a little emphasis. That is all I ask. Miss Marple left the police station with the sense of having moved one piece into its proper place. By 11 o'clock she was back at her own fireside. Dolly Bantry was already there. Dolly had a key by long arrangement and made use of it whenever she arrived before Miss Marple returned, on the entirely sensible grounds that standing on a doorstep in October was an occupation better suited to younger people. The kettle was already on. Dolly herself sat forward in her chair with an expression of focused inquiry she had plainly been cultivating during the wait. Well? Dolly demanded. He will make inquiries, said Miss Marple, removing her gloves. Did he believe you? Miss Marple considered this fairly. He did not disbelieve me. With Inspector Slack that is approximately the same thing and perhaps as much as could realistically be hoped for at this stage. Dolly poured the tea and settled back with the air of a woman who had been patient under difficult circumstances and now expected to be rewarded with a full account. Miss Marple gave her one. Not every word. Miss Marple rarely wasted words. But she related the substance, Slack's objections, his interest, the points that had troubled him, the moment at which he'd begun to take notes, and the reluctant concession that inquiries would be made. Dolly listened with the quality of attention that was one of her most underrated gifts. The visit, she said when Miss Marple had finished. That is what keeps returning to me. Mrs. Morrow mentioned calling on Mrs. Carrington, but not that evening. She mentioned one visit to Mr. Price, but not a possible second one. It is a particular sort of omission, isn't it? Yes, said Miss Marple, very particular. Not quite a lie. No, a lie requires a question. These were volunteered accounts. Partial ones. Dolly frowned. So she mentioned enough to seem open. Exactly. If anyone had seen her near either house, it would not appear strange. She had already admitted to visiting. Acknowledging one call makes another less conspicuous. It creates the impression of candour. But she did not acknowledge the second visit to Mr. Price. No, Mrs. Goddard was not absolutely certain. And Mrs. Morrow, I think, relied upon that uncertainty. Miss Marple set down her cup. Mrs. Goddard notices things, but she's also a woman inclined to doubt her own noticing once other people appear certain. She has already begun to persuade herself she may be mistaken. People do forget ordinary calls, Dolly said, though without much conviction. They do. That is what I told Mrs. Goddard. It is also what Mrs. Morrow would rely upon. Forgetfulness is one of the best places for a deliberate omission to hide. Dolly looked at the fire. But why? She said at last. That is what I cannot get past. Why would she want to? What could Mrs. Carrington or Mr. Price have known about her that could possibly justify? She stopped. It seemed so very drastic for a village matter. Miss Marple's eyes were kind, but her answer came without softness. Village matters are not smaller than other matters, my dear. They only appear so from the outside. To the person at the centre of them, they are as large as life itself. one's reputation, one's security, one's place in the world. These things do not become trivial merely because the stage is small. Dolly said nothing. Miss Marple looked into the fire. I do not yet know the precise nature of what was known. That is what Inspector Slack's inquiries may reveal. But I think it touched the very centre of how Mrs. Morrow sees herself and how she is seen by others. She paused. She is a woman for whom appearance and reality are not the same thing, but they are deeply connected. She manages how she's perceived not merely out of vanity. I think it is closer to survival. Such women can be admirable in ordinary life. They maintain themselves with courage and discipline. But if that maintenance is threatened, they may show a resolution others would never expect from them. Dolly sat very still. Outside, the wind had risen. It came from the north, carrying with it the first true edge of the winter that had been threatening for weeks. The fire responded with a small settling sound, intimate and domestic. The person who came through the gate, Dolly said slowly. She'd been there before. She knew the way in. Yes, said Miss Marple, she knew the way in. And Mrs. Carrington put the chair out to meet her. I believe so. Then she was expecting her. Yes. It was not an unwelcome visit. No, Miss Marple said quietly. That is perhaps the saddest part. Edith Carrington and Leonard Price both received someone they knew. Under ordinary friendly circumstances, neither had reason to be afraid. She folded her hands in her lap, and that is precisely what made it possible. The wind pressed softly at the window, not violently, but with persistence, as though asking to be acknowledged. Miss Marple picked up her knitting. There is still much to establish, she said. Inspector Slack will find what he finds, and I believe Miss Trent may know more than she has said. Sylvia Trent. Yes, she noticed the cup, not merely as an oddity, I think, but as a confirmation of something already troubling her. I should like to speak with her once more when the moment is right. Dolly watched her with fond apprehension. And if Inspector Slack's inquiries produce nothing definite, then, said Miss Marple, we shall see. It was not evasion. It was the honest answer of a woman who had followed many hidden paths before, and knew that the final shape of a thing did not always appear until one had nearly reached it. We shall see. The fire burned steadily. The wind continued its civil inquiry at the window, and in the warm order of Miss Marple's sitting room, the knitting needles resumed their patient, measured rhythm, as though counting down to something neither woman yet named aloud. Chapter 8. The Hour That Refused to Match. Miss Sylvia Trent opened her door on Friday morning with the expression of a woman who had expected a visitor, and, after some private deliberation, had decided to receive her. It was not the same expression she'd worn during Miss Marple's previous call. Then Sylvia had been composed and professional, guarding the boundary between what might properly be said and what ought properly to remain private. This morning there was something different in her face. Not anxiety, not surrender, but decision. She admitted Miss Marple without preamble and led her into the sitting room. A fire had been lit against the grey morning chill. 2 cups had already been placed beside the teapot. Miss Marple noticed this with quiet approval. When a woman set out 2 cups before her visitor arrived, it meant one of 2 things. Either she had been warned to expect the visit, which in this case she had not, or she had expected it herself. And if she had expected it herself, then very likely she had something to say. Miss Trent poured tea with her usual economy of movement and sat opposite Miss Marple without fuss. "I have been thinking," she said. "Yes," said Miss Marple. "About the account discrepancy." Miss Marple waited. "I told you previously," Miss Trent continued, holding her cup but not drinking from it, "that I had noticed a small discrepancy in Mrs. Carrington's household accounts. That was why I went to the house on the morning Mrs. Foster found her." She paused. "I was not prepared then to say more about the nature of that discrepancy. I was not certain it was relevant, and professional discretion seemed the proper instinct." "And now?" Miss Marple asked. "Now," said Miss Trent, "I am not sure professional discretion is serving anyone particularly well." She set down her cup. Her gaze was direct, cool, and assessing. The gaze of a woman accustomed to separating fact from feeling, and not inclined to dramatise either. Mrs. Carrington had a small additional income beyond her widow's pension, and the interest from her late husband's investments. It arrived quarterly, always in the same amount, and had been doing so for approximately 8 years. Miss Marple's hands remained still. She never explained its source to me, Sylvia continued. I did not ask. Clients are entitled to privacy, provided their accounts are properly maintained. The money was declared. There was nothing irregular in that sense. But approximately 4 months ago, Miss Marple said softly, it stopped. Miss Trent's eyes sharpened almost imperceptibly. Yes, it stopped. She leaned back slightly. I noticed when reviewing the September figures. The payment had failed to appear for the 3rd consecutive quarter. Mrs. Carrington had adjusted her household expenditure in several small ways. Nothing dramatic, but quite clear to anyone accustomed to reading accounts. Slightly less at the grocer's. A postponed repair to the sitting-room curtain rail, which she had mentioned in July and not carried out in August. A reduced order of coal, small economies. She did not mention the stopped payment to you? No, but she was orderly in financial matters. She would have noticed it. That was why I intended to speak with her. On the morning she was found. Yes, Miss Trent's voice remained even. I had the figures with me. I did not have the opportunity. Miss Marple absorbed this in silence. The fire made a small sound in the grate. Outside, the November morning lay grey and motionless, with that curious stillness that sometimes comes between weather systems, when one thing has ended and another has not quite begun. You formed a view, Miss Marple said at last, about the nature of those payments. It was not quite a question. Miss Trent accepted it as such. I formed a hypothesis, she said precisely. A consistent quarterly payment over 8 years suggests an arrangement, not a gift made on impulse, not a debt casually repaid, something agreed upon and maintained. It had the character of a private transfer. From a single source. From a single source. A personal account, not an institution. And that source ceased paying 4 months ago. Yes. Miss Marple looked at the teacup before her, then back at Miss Trent. I should like to ask you something about timing. Miss Trent inclined her head. I have been considering the timelines of both deaths, Miss Marple said. There is something about them that has sat at the back of my mind rather like a faint sound one cannot quite ignore. That is often how important things begin, said Miss Trent. Miss Marple smiled slightly. Mrs. Carrington died, as far as one can judge, on a Tuesday evening, and was found on Wednesday morning. Mr. Price died, again as far as can be established, on a Thursday evening, and was found on Friday morning. I have been attempting to form a picture of who was where and when on both evenings. And? What I cannot satisfactorily account for is Mrs. Morrow's movements on the Thursday evening. Miss Trent said nothing, but her attention sharpened. She has referred, in different conversations, to being at the Church Hall Committee earlier in the evening and then at home. But Mrs. Pierce, who lives opposite her, mentioned something quite casually. She did not realise its significance. She was speaking only of Mrs. Morrow's usual punctuality. What did she say? That the lights in Mrs. Morrow's front rooms were not lit until later than she would have expected if Mrs. Morrow had returned directly from the committee. Miss Trent placed her cup carefully in its saucer. Could Mrs. Pierce be mistaken? Of course. People may always be mistaken. But she had a troublesome tooth that evening and was awake later than usual. She looked out before drawing her curtains and noticed that Mrs. Morrow's front room was still dark. She thought Mrs. Morrow must have gone straight to bed without sitting in the front room, which was unlike her. What time was this? Mrs. Pierce's lights were out by 10. She remembers that clearly because she had taken something for the tooth. The Church Hall Committee generally finishes at 7. That leaves more than 2 hours. Yes, said Miss Marple. Rather more than 2 hours unaccounted for. Miss Trent was silent for a moment. Then she said, Vicarage Lane, where Mr. Price lodged, is a 10-minute walk from Mrs. Morrow's house. Yes. and it can be reached by the back passage without going along the main street. Yes, said Miss Marple, it can. The fire settled in the grate with a comfortable domestic sigh, entirely at odds with the nature of the conversation. Miss Marple noticed the contrast, as she often noticed such things. Warmth, order, china cups, and beneath them the cold plainness of human motive. The payments, Miss Marple said, if your hypothesis is correct, suggest a private arrangement of some duration. One might ask who in Mrs. Carrington's life had reason to maintain such an arrangement. Who had the means, the intimacy, and the motive to continue a quarterly transfer for 8 years? One might, said Miss Trent. Her tone indicated that she already had. Someone Mrs. Carrington knew well, Miss Marple continued. Someone she trusted. Someone with whom she had made, or accepted, a private understanding. And someone, Miss Trent added quietly, who had reason 4 months ago to end that understanding. Precisely, Miss Marple's eyes rested on the fire. But ending it may not have been sufficient. Mrs. Carrington was a woman of regular habits and quiet intelligence. She would have noticed the cessation. She would have thought about it. She may even have asked questions. And if she did, then the person who stopped the payments might have become uneasy. Miss Trent's face was very still. And Mr. Price? Mr. Price was thorough. He had a tidy mind. He asked Mrs. Morrow, after Mrs. Carrington's death, whether Edith had been troubled by anything in her last days. Yes, Miss Trent said, that would matter. I think he may have been following the same thread. Perhaps Mrs. Carrington had said something to him. Something small, something half expressed, perhaps in one of their conversations about postcards, a reference to money, to disappointment, to a promise broken. After her death, he began to inquire. And he let the wrong person know he was inquiring. I fear so. Miss Trent looked toward the fire. She was my client for 11 years, she said after a moment. She did not speak readily of personal matters, but she was not, as a rule, an unhappy woman. In the last few months she was preoccupied. I attributed it to her health. It may partly have been her health, Miss Marple said gently, but I think it was also something else. I think she knew an agreement on which she had relied had been withdrawn, and I think she was beginning to understand what that withdrawal revealed about the person who had made it. Miss Trent turned her cup slowly in its saucer. What will you do with all this? It was not a challenge. It was the question of someone who had now stepped across a boundary and wished to know where the path led. I shall take it to Inspector Slack, Miss Marple said, together with 1 or 2 other details that have come to light, and I shall suggest, as I have already suggested, that the pattern of these 2 deaths is not the pattern of natural coincidence. She set her cup down. The timing matters, Miss Trent. When 2 deaths follow the same shape, the same kind of evening, the same solitary circumstances, the same careful arrangement afterward, and when the movements of one particular person cannot be fully accounted for on both relevant evenings, the word coincidence becomes increasingly difficult to sustain. Miss Trent met her eyes. Will Inspector Slack accept it? He will be given rather more to accept than he was on my previous visit. Miss Marple said it calmly, not triumphantly. She took no pleasure in being right about such things. But there was in her now the composure of a woman who had assembled enough of the picture to know, with sorrowful confidence, what the missing parts were likely to show. Outside, the first breath of the next weather system touched the window. It came softly, patiently, like something that had been travelling toward its destination for a long time and had finally arrived. Miss Trent poured more tea. For a little while neither woman spoke. It was not an awkward silence. It was the silence that comes when 2 intelligent people have understood one another and know that further words, for the moment, would be decoration rather than use. Chapter 9. What the Pattern Quietly Revealed. There comes a moment in any difficult matter when the individual pieces, gathered separately and examined with patient care, cease to be separate pieces at all. It is not always a dramatic moment. In Miss Marple's experience, it rarely was. Truth did not usually enter with a clap of thunder or a cry in the night. More often it arrived quietly, almost politely, as though it had been standing in the room for some time and had only just cleared its throat. One did not so much discover it as recognize it. One had known the shape all along, perhaps. One had merely been waiting for enough light to fall upon it. Miss Marple spent the Saturday indoors, and the weather fully approved the decision. Rain had arrived in the night with the steady determination of something intending to remain. It fell without passion, but with great persistence, darkening the lanes, silvering the bare branches and sending St. Mary Mead into the warm authority of kitchens, parlours, sculleries and sitting rooms. It was a day for domestic occupations. It was also a day for thought. Miss Marple sat by the fire with her knitting through the morning. The needles moved regularly, though not quickly. She was not making haste. Haste, she had always believed, was the enemy of good wool and clear reasoning alike. Piece by piece, the matter arranged itself, not forced, not hurried. The hands, the cup, the handbag, the garden chair, the visits mentioned and not mentioned, the quarterly payments, the missing time, the woman who had arranged everything with too much care. By 11 o'clock, Miss Marple laid down her knitting and took out her notebook. She wrote for several minutes in her small exact hand, filling 2 pages. The sentences were spare and orderly. Each point followed the previous one with the quiet inevitability of a well-stitched seam. She did not write conjecture. Miss Marple distrusted conjecture in ink. Ink gave a thing too much dignity too soon. What she wrote were observations, times, names, habits, and those small visible facts which, when placed together, possessed a strength none of them had possessed alone. When she'd finished, she read the pages back. Then she closed the notebook and sat for a while, looking at the rain on the window. Mrs. Agnes Morrow had come to St. Mary Mead 17 years earlier as the wife of Mr. Gerald Morrow, a man who had made a modest but sufficient living in insurance. He had died 9 years later, leaving his widow comfortably, though not extravagantly provided for. Since then, Mrs. Morrow had occupied a particular and well-maintained place in the village. She was useful, she was kind, she was respectable, she was invited where it mattered, consulted where tact was needed, and trusted in that unspoken way a village trusts a woman who remembers illnesses, anniversaries, household preferences, and social obligations. She had no obvious trouble, no visible scandal, no pressing financial desperation, no dramatic enemy. But Miss Marple knew that obvious trouble was not the only kind. There were quieter troubles, older troubles, buried ones, and buried things had a way of remaining alive underground. Inspector Slack's inquiries, which he had reported by telephone on Thursday evening with the slightly grudging thoroughness of a man who had found more than he expected and did not entirely enjoy the fact, had not produced anything theatrical. But they had produced history, and history, Miss Marple knew, was seldom as finished as people believed. Before she had been Mrs. Gerald Morrow, Agnes Morrow had been Miss Agnes Peel. She had worked as a private secretary in a solicitor's office in a town some 30 miles away. She had been capable, trusted, and discreet. Her position had given her access to correspondence, client matters, documents, and certain financial details. Then irregularities had been noticed, small ones. Not the sort that immediately brought scandal crashing through the door. Not even, perhaps, the sort that a busy practice wished to expose publicly if it could be avoided. But small irregularities in accounts have a cumulative character. They sit quietly at first, then gather weight. Eventually they present themselves to anyone patient enough or unlucky enough to look carefully. The matter had been handled quietly, discreetly, professionally. Miss Agnes Peel had left the practice. Shortly afterwards she had married Gerald Morrow. In due course she had come to St. Mary Mead. That by itself proved nothing about the present, but it explained why the present might have had to be protected. The quarterly payments to Mrs. Carrington were the bridge between the two. They had continued for 8 years. They had come regularly, privately, and in the same amount. Then 4 months ago they had stopped. Miss Marple had thought carefully about how such an arrangement might have begun. Mrs. Edith Carrington had lived in St. Mary Mead for many years. Everyone agreed she was mild, regular, and quietly intelligent. She was not a woman who enjoyed power over others. She was not malicious. She did not dramatize private knowledge or use it for social triumph. But she had known Mrs. Morrow for a long time, and long acquaintance, especially in a village, has a way of producing knowledge without anyone actively seeking it. A name mentioned carelessly, an old letter glimpsed, a story half told by someone who had forgotten who was connected to whom, a date that did not fit, a coincidence remembered at the wrong moment. Perhaps Mrs. Carrington had discovered something about Agnes Peel. Perhaps she had recognised something Mrs. Morrow believed safely left behind. Perhaps the discovery had not been dramatic at all. Miss Marple rather thought it had not. These things did not always begin as blackmail. That was a crude word, and crude words often flattened the truth. Sometimes such arrangements began as accommodation, as mutual discomfort managed quietly, as an understanding never fully spoken. One person knew. The other person knew she knew. Money passed, not with threats attached, but as the price of silence, reassurance, and continued peace. The money had maintained the boundary. Mrs. Carrington had kept silent. Mrs. Morrow had continued paying, and both women had gone on taking tea together as though nothing lay beneath the polished surface of their friendship. That, Miss Marple thought, was perhaps the most revealing thing, not the payments themselves, but the discipline required to live with them. For 8 years Mrs. Carrington had received Mrs. Morrow as a friend. She had spoken to her, entertained her, trusted her with small matters, and allowed village life to go on undisturbed. This suggested that Mrs. Carrington had not despised her. She had not used the arrangement as a means of humiliation. She had not wished to destroy her. She had simply known. And Mrs. Morrow, for her part, had maintained the friendship with full knowledge of its cost. She had smiled, called, remembered preferences, arranged flowers, offered sympathy, and continued to be indispensable. That required an uncommon compartmentalization. Miss Marple had seen such people before, people capable of keeping one part of life entirely sealed from another. People who could inhabit a respectable surface so completely that even they almost forgot what lay beneath it until something threatened to break through. 4 months ago the payments had stopped. Why? Perhaps Mrs. Morrow's circumstances had altered. Perhaps the strain had become intolerable. Perhaps she had decided that after 8 years the danger had passed. Or perhaps, having spent so long managing a secret, she had grown resentful of the person who quietly embodied it. Whatever the reason, Mrs. Carrington had noticed. Of course she had noticed. A woman of regular habits, living carefully on a limited income, did not fail to notice the absence of quarterly money. She had adjusted household expenses. She had postponed repairs. She had reduced small comforts. And in doing so, she had begun to think. Perhaps she had spoken to Leonard Price, not dramatically, not with accusations, perhaps only with uneasiness, a remark about money, a puzzled sentence, a reference to an old matter. But Leonard Price was a thorough man, a retired clerk, a man trained by profession and temperament to notice discrepancies. After Mrs. Carrington's death, he had begun to ask questions, and in asking Mrs. Morrow whether Edith had been troubled by anything in her last days, he had very likely revealed that his mind had begun to move in the correct direction. That had made him dangerous, not publicly dangerous, not loudly dangerous, quietly dangerous, which, Miss Marple thought, was often the most dangerous kind of all. Inspector Slack was now looking more closely into the payments. Miss Trent, whose professional caution had finally yielded to professional conscience, would provide the relevant documentation. Mrs. Pierce's recollection about Mrs. Morrow's unlit windows on the night of Mr. Price's death would be taken down properly. The timings would be tested. The back lanes would be considered. The visits would be examined. But Miss Marple already understood the pattern. The deaths had not been the work of panic. That was important. A panicked person is careless in large ways. Mrs. Carrington's and Mr. Price's rooms did not show large carelessness. They showed the opposite: too much order, too much composure, too much attention to what a peaceful death ought to look like. The positioned hands, the closed clasp, the displaced cup. These were not accidents of confusion. They were the marks of character. A person who had spent years managing a double reality would not necessarily collapse under pressure. She might become calmer, more exact, more determined to put every visible thing into proper shape. And because she was arranging death as she arranged life, she left herself behind in the arrangement. That, Miss Marple thought, was always the danger. One could conceal an act. It was much harder to conceal oneself. When Dolly Bantry arrived at 2 o'clock, the rain had settled into a steady, companionable rhythm against the windows. Miss Marple had made fresh tea and was sitting in her usual chair with her notebook closed on the small table beside her. Dolly came in smelling of wet wool, cold air and umbrella silk. She shook out her umbrella in the hall and appeared in the sitting room with an expression of immediate attention. "You look," she said, "as though you have sorted something." "I have sorted a great deal," said Miss Marple. Dolly removed her gloves. "And?" "Whether it can be brought to a proper conclusion is not entirely within my control, but the pattern, I think, is now clear." Dolly sat down, accepted tea, and looked at her friend with the expression of someone who had been waiting for this moment, and was not altogether glad that it had come. There was relief in her face, certainly, but also the sadness that arrives before a truth is spoken aloud, when one already suspects what it will cost. "The details are small," Miss Marple said, "but they repeat. And because they repeat, they begin to speak." "The hands," Dolly said. "Yes." "The cup." "Yes." "The handbag." "And the chair." Dolly shivered slightly, though the room was warm. "It is strange," she said. "Any one of them might be nothing." "Quite. Anyone might be nothing. A hand may rest oddly. A cup may be moved. A bag may be closed. A chair may face a gate. But together they reveal the same quality, the same carefulness, the same concern with surface appearance, the same instinct to arrange what might otherwise look untidy or inconvenient." Miss Marple looked toward the window, where the rain wrote and rewrote itself against the glass. "They reveal character," she said, "and character in the end is what solves these things." Dolly looked up. "Not evidence?" "Evidence is necessary, of course, but evidence alone is seldom enough unless one understands the person to whom it belongs. Evidence is character made visible. Once one understands the person, the details begin to arrange themselves in the proper order." Dolly was quiet. "What happens now?" "Now," said Miss Marple, "I shall ask Inspector Slack to arrange a meeting." "A meeting?" "Yes. There are 1 or 2 things that must be said plainly, and 1 or 2 people who ought to be present when they are said." "Where?" "I think the vicarage would be suitable. The Reverend Clement is a man of sound judgment and considerable discretion, and it will be better, I think, if the occasion is conducted somewhere that carries a little dignity." Dolly nodded slowly. Then, after a moment, she said, "She will know, won't she?" Miss Marple's eyes rested on the fire. "That something is coming?" "Yes." "I think she has known for several days." "How awful!" "Yes," said Miss Marple quietly. "It is perhaps the loneliest possible knowledge." She lifted her cup. "But it is hers. It has been hers since the beginning, and there is nothing in the world to be done about that." The rain continued its even, unhurried observation of the afternoon. The fire answered softly. And in the quiet room, where so many small truths had been received without fuss, Miss Marple sat with her hands folded and waited for the last necessary arrangement to be made. Chapter 10. The Truth, Hidden Between 2 Endings. The vicarage drawing-room was, on most occasions, a room of considerable warmth and informality. It was the kind of room that could only have belonged to a clergyman who had lived among his books, his parishioners, and his own mild disorganisation for many years. The cushions were worn but comfortable. The theological volumes on the shelves stood in various states of obedience. A small table near the fire held correspondence, a pipe rack, a cracked ink stand, and 3 hymn books which had plainly been placed there for a reason no one now remembered. It was not a grand room. It was not an official room. It was, Miss Marple thought, exactly the right room. A formal police station would have hardened everyone. A solicitor's office would have made the matter too legal too soon. But the vicarage drawing-room carried another quality: decency, gravity, and the faint reminder that human beings are more than the worst thing they have done, even when that thing must still be answered for. Miss Marple arrived early. She always arrived early when something delicate was to be managed. She took the chair nearest the fire, not the central chair, not the most commanding position, but one from which she could see every face in the room. The Reverend Clement greeted her with quiet seriousness. He understood, without needing it explained in too much detail, that he had been asked to provide a setting rather than a role. That was to his credit. His wife brought tea, looked once from Miss Marple to the empty chairs, and then withdrew with the tact of a woman well acquainted with parish difficulties. Inspector Slack arrived at 2:45 with Sergeant Briggs, a young man of reliable silence whose chief function that afternoon was to be present in an official capacity and to remember it afterward. Slack placed himself near the window. His expression was carefully composed. During the past few days he had reconsidered his first position several times. He would not, Miss Marple thought, have described himself as convinced, but he had found facts, and facts are obstinate things. In practical terms, he was now where she had hoped he would be. Dolly arrived at 3:20 and sat beside Miss Marple with the loyal solidarity of a very old friend. Miss Sylvia Trent arrived precisely on the half-hour. That was entirely in keeping with her character. She took a chair to one side and sat with the self-contained stillness of someone who knew why she was there and had no need to fill the room with needless speech. Mrs. Agnes Morrow was the last to arrive. She came at 4:25, dressed with her usual restrained elegance. Her dark coat was well cut. Her gloves were immaculate. Her hat was suitable without being conspicuous. Everything about her appearance had been considered, but nothing had been overdone. When she entered and saw the assembled company, there was a single instant of absolute stillness. Not surprise. Confirmation. It was the stillness of a person who has been expecting something for a long time and has now watched it arrive. Then her face resumed its customary composure as smoothly as water closing over a dropped stone. The Reverend Clement offered her a chair. She thanked him. Tea was offered. She accepted it. She folded her hands in her lap. Miss Marple looked at those hands. They were steady. For a moment Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that came to her at such times. It was not pity exactly. Pity could be too easy, and sometimes too flattering to the person who felt it. This was something more sober. The recognition of waste. Agnes Morrow had intelligence, discipline, social grace and courage of a kind. For 17 years she had built a life in St. Mary Mead and maintained it with skill. She had made herself useful, admired, needed. She had understood people well enough to comfort them, guide them, and move among them without friction. And all of it had been built around concealment. "I think," Miss Marple said, in the gentle, measured voice she used when something painful had to be said without unnecessary cruelty, "that we all understand to some degree why we are here." No one spoke. "I should like, if I may, to set out what I believe happened, not as an accusation in the theatrical sense, but as a narrative. In my experience, it is kinder in the end to speak plainly. Circumlocution so often prolongs suffering without improving truth." Mrs. Morrow looked down at her hands. Inspector Slack did not interrupt. Miss Marple began. She spoke first of the 2 deaths. Mrs. Edith Carrington, found seated by the window in her sitting room, apparently peaceful. Mr. Leonard Price, found in his armchair by his window, also peaceful. Both deaths certified naturally. Both, at first glance, requiring no suspicion. Then she spoke of the details. The hands, two arranged in both cases. The teacup placed on the wrong side of the saucer for a right-handed woman of fixed habit. The handbag belonging to Mr. Price, usually left open each morning, found closed, fastened, and lying neatly on his lap. The garden chair in late October turned not toward the apple tree or the light, but toward the back gate. The visits acknowledged in part and omitted in part. She spoke of Mrs. Carrington's quarterly payments and their sudden cessation 4 months earlier. She spoke of Miss Trent's discovery of the missing income and of Mrs. Carrington's quiet economies afterward. She spoke of Agnes Peel, who had once worked in a solicitor's office 30 miles away, and of the irregularities which had been noticed there long ago and handled quietly. She spoke of history returning, not loudly, not as scandal, but as pressure. She spoke of Leonard Price, thorough and methodical, asking questions after Mrs. Carrington's death. A man who, because he noticed small things and understood regular habits, had begun to see that his friend's death did not quite sit naturally among the facts surrounding it. And she spoke of Mrs. Morrow's conversation with him, during which he had almost certainly revealed, without intending to, that he was following a thread she could not afford to have followed. Miss Marple's voice did not rise. She did not accuse with passion. She laid each thing down carefully, one after another, as one lays pieces of a pattern on a table, until even those who dislike the pattern must see what it forms. The fire crackled once. Rain, which had resumed that morning, pressed steadily against the windows. No one in the room moved. When Miss Marple finished, silence remained. It was Mrs. Morrow who broke it. Miss Marple had expected she might. Agnes Morrow was not a woman who could allow another person to write the whole of her ending. Even now, perhaps especially now, she needed to manage her own narrative. The payments, Mrs. Morrow said, were voluntary. I know, said Miss Marple. A faint look of surprise crossed Mrs. Morrow's face, quickly controlled. Edith never asked for them. Not directly. She never threatened me. She never said a word that could be repeated. Her voice was low but clear. She simply knew, and I provided. It was understood between us without being spoken. Yes, said Miss Marple. I think that is the most accurate description. Mrs. Morrow looked at her. She was not cruel. No, said Miss Marple softly. I do not believe she was. Edith was not cruel, Mrs. Morrow repeated, as though the point mattered to her more than anyone might have expected. It was an old difficulty, one I thought had been left behind, but it followed me farther than I believed it could. When you stopped the payments, Miss Marple said, Mrs. Carrington noticed. In June, Mrs. Morrow said. I stopped them in June. Her voice had lost all colour now. It was flat, exact, almost formal. I told myself that enough time had passed, that it no longer mattered, that she would understand perhaps, or say nothing. She had said nothing for 8 years. But she noticed. Yes, she noticed. She did not confront me. She would not have done that. But I saw that she knew the payment had stopped, and I understood what her knowing meant. Miss Trent sat very still, her eyes lowered. Inspector Slack looked toward the window. The Reverend Clement had the expression of a man listening to something he would have to carry long after the room had emptied. And Mr. Price, Miss Marple asked quietly. The silence changed. It was no longer the silence of waiting. It was the silence of something fully reached. He was a thorough man, Mrs. Morrow said. Miss Marple did not move. He had noticed something Edith said. I do not know precisely what. Perhaps she mentioned the money. Perhaps only that something had changed. But after the funeral he asked me whether she had seemed worried about any financial matter toward the end. She paused. He said it in the most ordinary way, but he was watching me very carefully. And you understood what that watching meant? "Yes," said Mrs. Morrow. "I understood." She said nothing further. Miss Marple did not press her. There were matters now for Inspector Slack. The exact means, the precise reconstruction, the formal statement, the evidence necessary for law rather than understanding. He would attend to those things with the professional thoroughness which was, in his way, one of his strengths. The why had been illuminated enough. To demand every last inch of confession would not serve truth. It would only satisfy curiosity, and Miss Marple distrusted curiosity when it began to dress itself as justice. Inspector Slack cleared his throat. When he spoke, his voice had changed. It was official now, careful and formal. Mrs. Morrow received the words without visible collapse. She did not protest. She did not faint. She did not perform outrage or despair. She answered what was directly asked with the same precision that had marked every other part of her life. Even now, Miss Marple thought, she remained herself. That was the terrible thing. When the formalities had been completed, Mrs. Morrow left with Inspector Slack and Sergeant Briggs. The door closed behind them with a soft but final sound. The drawing-room remained very still. Rooms after such departures have a quality of their own, not unpleasant exactly, but weighted. The air requires time before ordinary conversation can move through it again. The Reverend Clement refilled the cups. Dolly looked into the fire. Miss Trent sat with her usual composure, though her shoulders suggested the composure was doing more work than usual. For several minutes no one spoke. Then Dolly sighed. A slow release of something she'd been holding with effort. "It all seemed so ordinary," she said. "Every part of it." Miss Marple set down her cup. She reached for her knitting, which she had brought as a matter of habit. The needles took their familiar place in her hands. After a moment, they began to move. "Yes, my dear," she said. "It often does." Dolly looked at her. All those little things, the cup, the clasp, the chair, they seem almost absurdly small. "They are small," Miss Marple said. "That is why they are valuable. Large things are attended to. Small things are done almost unconsciously. They reveal the person." She looked toward the fire. "We imagine that the remarkable hides behind the remarkable, but it rarely does. It hides behind the ordinary, behind good manners, behind usefulness, behind a teacup put down on the wrong side, a handbag closed too neatly, a chair turned toward a gate." She paused. "Behind a repeated gesture." Outside, the November rain continued its patient, unhurried work. The village of St. Mary Mead went about its afternoon in the quiet, decent, unremarkable way it generally did. Curtains were drawn, kettles were boiled, letters were opened, fires were mended. Someone complained about the weather in the butcher's shop. Someone else carried chrysanthemums through the churchyard. Life resumed its ordinary shape. And yet Miss Marple knew, as she had always known, that ordinary life was never simple merely because it was ordinary. It contained everything: kindness, fear, habit, weakness, concealment, truth. She knitted. The fire buzzed, and the rain spoke softly and at length against the window.